Hi, I'm Kira and welcome back to my channel where I make videos to equip and encourage you to live life on mission. So I'm currently in California and I thought it would be a perfect place to make a video on how I use some of my favorite gospel tracts in my day-to-day life. And these gospel tracts are from a ministry that's out here in California or based out here in California called Living Waters Ministry. And if you've never heard of this ministry, I strongly recommend checking them out on YouTube. And all their online resources, and they also have an online store where they have a bunch of books, resources, articles, and a ton of other gospel tracts that are awesome. So one of my favorite gospel tracts is this IQ test gospel tract, and there's 5 different options online. And when I first was checking out these gospel tracts, I got the 5-pack of the 5 different ones, the pack of the 5 different ones. And this one just ended up being my favorite. They're all great. The only thing that's different is the color and the riddle on the front. And one of them deals with math, and there's some different ones, and they're all awesome. This is just my favorite, and it's fun to start a conversation with people. So that's different. The questions on the back and everything that's on the inside is the same. And so check those out to see the different options. So this specific one says, "What is greater than God, worse than the devil? The dead eat it, and if the living eat it, they die." And I love it. It's really fun and it's not too complex, but it's also really complex, and it's really fun to have conversations with strangers or with anybody, and people get a kick out of it, and they get really excited. I've had great reactions from people. People get excited, they want to show other people, people show their coworkers. I've experienced all of that, and it's been a lot of fun. So I really like this one. So I just thought I would make a video for my friends and for any Christians out there who don't use gospel tracts, who've never heard of gospel tracts, or who've only seen certain types of gospel tracts and weren't interested in using them. So there are a ton of options on the Living Waters website. This is just my favorite one, and I'll share how I use it. And I wrote down 4 different ways that I use it and that I will encourage you to use it. So before I talk about that, I just wanted to share a quote from Charles Spurgeon, and he said, "When preaching and private talk are not available, you need to have a tract ready. Get good, striking tracts, or none at all. But a touching gospel tract may be the seed of eternal life. Therefore, do not go out without your tracts." And I first heard that quote from the Living Waters book called The School of Biblical Evangelism. And there are a couple lessons on gospel tracts, which I also recommend that book. That's a great resource for any Christian, for anyone who wants to learn a bit more about Christianity. And it unpacks Christianity, and it hits on some of the main world religions in 101 lessons. But I love that. I think that's really great. It's great going out with tracts, always having them ready, because you never know what God's going to do with a simple piece of paper that doesn't really take any more effort or time. It's just having it with you and being ready to hand it out. So I ranked these 4 tips in terms of the easiest to do if you've never used gospel tracts before, to the most involved, the most time, the most work, all of that. So I would say if you haven't ever used gospel tracts, start at 1 and then move down. And I'll share which one is my favorite, which one I use the most often, or which way I use the most often. So the first way that you can use gospel tracts, that I use gospel tracts, is just leaving them places. So whenever I'm at a restaurant and I sign my check, I leave them on the table with my check. So that's one way. I've left them in bathrooms before by the sink. And they're striking. They're like, what? IQ test? What is this? And people pick it up, and you never know what God's going to do with something like that. I've left them in the card reader at the gas station, at the gas pump before, because they have to take it out to put their card in. And then just anywhere that you go, you can leave them. Now, don't litter them. I don't litter with them, but anywhere that you can set them down. I've set them down at counters before where there's other cards. I'll put that down, and then whenever someone comes up, then they can pick it up and check it out. So just leaving them places where you're not even interacting with people. You're just setting it down and then just praying and trusting that God's going to do what God's going to do with it. So that's the first way to use these gospel tracts. The second way is handing them out whenever I meet strangers. So we all run into strangers all the time, every single day. I look for those opportunities because I love meeting new people, and I'm currently on a road trip by myself, and I meet people everywhere I go. So I have a lot of opportunities where I'm just running into people, but we're all approached by people who are trying to sell us things, or if we're checking out groceries or we're buying fast food, that's an encounter with a stranger, and the ice is already broken because you're already talking to them. And so it's really easy just to hand them a gospel tract and say something like, hey, I love giving these out whenever I meet people. What do you think the answer is? It's a little riddle. Or I'll say like, oh, here's an IQ test. What do you think the answer is? And then I'll say like, it's not a real IQ test. Don't worry. And any form of that. I don't have like one thing I say, but anytime I have an encounter with a stranger, I try to have gospel tracts ready, and then I can just give them a gospel tract and ask them if they could guess the answer. Sometimes there's a long line behind me, and I'm not going to try and extend a conversation when there's a bunch of people in line waiting. I'll just hand it to them and say, hey, I love giving these out when I meet people. Check it out whenever you have a chance. There's some questions on the back that I hope it gives you something to think about. And so some form or fashion of that I'll say when I hand them out. So I don't necessarily just hand and leave. I have done that before though too, like if you're in a rush, or I'll say like, hey, thank you so much. I love giving these out when I meet people. It's a little riddle, it's fun, and the answer's on the inside, and then there's some questions on the back that I hope it challenges you and gives you something to think about that people don't normally think about. So paying for food, I'll pay with my credit card. When they give you my card back, I give them a gospel tract, and then I explain that little bit however I explain at that time. In the drive-thru, whenever I buy food in the drive-thru, I give them a gospel tract. If I'm getting groceries, when I check out, if I'm not going through self-checkout, then I give them a gospel tract. Another thing recently that I've really been noticing as a really great opportunity, since I'm out by myself on a road trip, I've gone to a lot of national parks and places where people want their picture taken, and people don't always want to ask people to take their picture. And so something that anyone can do that I think is a very loving thing to do and intentional thing to do is just ask people if you could take their picture. And it sounds really simple, but people get so happy and they're so excited, and not just like one picture and then give a gospel tract, but like take their picture and then do different angles and ask them if they like the picture. And it's something so simple, but people really appreciate it. So you're breaking the ice really easily. And then after a couple moments, they check out the picture. I might ask them like where they're from, or whatnot, maybe have a short little conversation, and then say, hey, there's this thing I like to hand out to people when I meet people. It's a fun little riddle. What do you think the answer is? And then I'll hand them a gospel tract. And I've got to hand out so many gospel tracts and have really great conversations just by taking pictures for people. Sometimes people will ask me to take their picture, and sometimes I'll see a family where the dad is maybe taking the picture of the wife and the kids, and then I offer like, would you like a picture together? Or the boyfriend's taking a picture of his girlfriend, and then I ask, do you want a picture together? And through that avenue, I can, the ice is already broken. You're already having a conversation with them. You're already talking to them, and then I can give them a gospel tract. So anytime that you're already having interaction, an encounter with a stranger is a great opportunity to hand them a gospel tract and then say, hey, I have this thing I like to hand out when I meet people. What do you think the answer is? And then after they read it, usually people are stumped by it and they're like, oh, that's kind of hard, or I don't know, I can't think of anything. And I kind of just am patient and let them think through it. And sometimes I'll say, there's 4 questions there. See if you can answer them individually and see if there's a common thread between all 4 questions, because the answer is going to be the same answer for all 4 questions. And sometimes that helps. Sometimes people read it and they're just like, want to look at the answer, and then they'll just open it up. And then I always point, the answer is right here, because people will have a tendency to open up the whole thing. And then after they read it, they're like, oh, that's what the answer is. Makes sense. And then they look and they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then after they read it, I say, there's also some more questions on the back that people don't normally think about if you want to check those out. Or I'll say, hey, there's a spiritual IQ test on the back. And sometimes people will turn it over and then go through the questions. There's 5 questions. And again, these are the same questions on every IQ gospel tract that Living Waters has. They have 5 different IQ tests on the front. And so the 5 questions that are on the back of every one are, is there a God? Does God care about right and wrong? Are God's standards the same as ours? Is there a hell? And do you avoid hell by living a good life? And so sometimes people will answer those questions as they go along. Sometimes they'll read one question, answer it to me. We'll have a whole conversation about that one question, and then they'll move on. I've had that happen before. Usually more recently, people have just been reading it and then answering kind of in their mind. And then after they go through it, then I say like, so what are your thoughts? Or I'll say like, oh, the answers are on the inside if you want to check out the answers on the inside. So that's really great. It's really great to, have a conversation with people you encounter. So the third way that I use these gospel tracts is kind of similar to the second way, is to start a gospel conversation. And so this is more so you initiating the conversation, you going up to the stranger, not as much it just happening like you're passing, like, you're paying for food somewhere. This is more so you going up to someone. So if I were to go up to someone, and I've gone up to people in the mall before, I've gone up to people at the parks before, on the trail, like if we're all relaxing, and then I'll go up to someone in that way. So it's me going up to them to start the conversation, opposed to we just are naturally meeting through an encounter. And so the way I do this, and not everyone is into walking up and talking to strangers. I love it, and so it just depends on your comfortability level. And so I'll just go up to people and say, hey, I'm Kira, and I have this riddle that I like to give people. What do you think the answer is? Now, sometimes whenever I go up to people, I start the conversation different ways. So I might say, hey, I'm Kira. Is there anything I can pray about for you? And if they say yes, then I'll pray with them. And then I might ask them a question to start the gospel conversation. But in regards to using the gospel tract, I've gone up to people before and just said, hey, I'm Kira. Or I'll just say, hey, I'm Kira. I have this card I like to give people. It's a riddle. What do you think the answer is? And people, depending on who you meet, some people are like really intrigued and they're super excited. And some people are like, oh, cool, and not as interested. And so you just kind of read people and kind of see how interested they are in talking to you. If someone's not interested in talking, then I usually catch on, or I try to catch on to that. And then I say, okay, well, I hope you have a great day, after handing it to them. So that's to start the gospel conversation. And the fourth way is after a gospel conversation. It gives them something to take home with them. And so let's say I've had a conversation with someone through whatever manner the conversation started. Usually it's, I went up to someone, asked them if I could pray for them, and if they said yes, then I'll pray with them, and then I might ask them a question. I like to ask people, can I ask you a crazy question? The question is, if you died today, how certain are you that you would go to heaven on a scale of 0 to 10? 10 being 100% sure and 0 being not sure at all. What would you say? And let people answer, and then I say, okay, the second question is, we're all going to die one day. Whenever you die, if you stood before God and if God said, why should I let you into heaven, what would you say? And so those are just two self-reflective questions that I like to ask. I don't always ask those two questions specifically, but they're really great questions to ask at the beginning after I pray with someone, if someone's open to being prayed for. So however the conversation starts, whenever it's over, I like to leave them with something tangible, because I'm probably never going to see this person ever again. I will sometimes ask them for their phone number, sometimes ask them if they have an Instagram, if I can follow them on Instagram, but I like to leave them with something that they can take home with them, that they can look at, that they can reflect on. And after sharing the gospel with them, if I was able to share the gospel with them, if they were open to having that conversation, these questions on the back of the spiritual IQ test are really great questions for them to continue reflecting on, because most of the time people aren't gonna up and follow Jesus immediately when you share the gospel with them. Most people need to hear the gospel many times before they are convicted and ready to surrender and follow Jesus. And I totally understand that. And it's not a loss if I leave a conversation and someone is like, okay, thank you, and not following Jesus. My goal and my purpose whenever I'm evangelizing, whenever I'm giving out gospel tracts, is just to be a vessel, just to be someone, just to be used by Jesus to encourage people to think about eternal things, to think about faith, to think about God, to think about their life, to think about the gospel, because a lot of people aren't thinking about it. I meet a lot of people who say, I'm just so busy, and I'm just so busy with life, and I don't have time to think about heaven and hell and what's going to happen when I die. I meet people all the time who say that. And it's really crazy, because we think we're going to live another 50 plus years, but tomorrow's not even promised. We don't know if we're going to wake up tomorrow. And so I always encourage people to think about this with a sense of urgency. I try to encourage people to think about it with a sense of urgency, and to just seek for the truth, but then be willing and humble to follow the truth whenever you find it. And that's not my truth and your truth. It is the truth, the absolute truth. And so that's some of the ways I like to use gospel tracts. Some tips that I have are to keep them handy, because if they're tucked away somewhere that I can't just pull out and hand out to someone, then I'm going to be less likely to use them. I'm going to be less likely to hand them out. So I try to keep them right next to my credit card. Keep a bunch right next to my credit card in my wallet. And so this is my wallet. So I, whenever I'm paying for food or groceries or whatever, I put my card in, and then I can hand a gospel tract out. So that's one place I like to keep them. I also have a little belt bag, and I like to keep my wallet in here, my phone in here, and my gospel tracts in here. I kind of say that it's like my gospel pouch. It's my gospel pouch. So it holds my gospel tracts, and it's right there on my chest, and I can keep, it's handy enough to be able to give out gospel tracts whenever I'm feel drawn to someone. Or like tonight, I was walking by a bunch of restaurants, and there was some people who work at the restaurant who are like the servers, but they're just waiting outside. And so whenever someone comes up, then they can seat them or whatnot. And so they look really bored. And so I'm like, oh, perfect opportunity to just hand a gospel tract out. So I gave out a gospel tract that way. So that's one tip, is just to keep them handy and have them with you. That's all I have to say right now about gospel tracts. That's on the top of my head, but I'll make some more videos on more in depth of questions I like to ask people to start a gospel conversation. But also something I do want to say, and I try and encourage people, is a couple things. So you're not responsible for someone else's salvation. That is not on you. We are witnesses of the gospel. We are carriers of the gospel. We are not people in charge of converting people. Like, we are not responsible for that. And so that weight and that burden and that pressure doesn't have to be on you, because it's not your job to convert anyone. It is your job to be faithful to the gospel, to be true to the gospel. And also, if someone's not interested in having a conversation about faith, about God, about the gospel, about what they believe, then don't force the conversation. It's not going to be beneficial or helpful to force a conversation that someone else doesn't want to have. It's not going to be helpful at all. So if someone doesn't want to talk, then I always say, like, okay, have a great day. Or if someone looks uncomfortable and I can kind of tell they're uncomfortable whenever I've asked them a question, then I say, oh, we don't have to talk about this if you don't want to. And then if they say, oh yeah, I don't want to talk about it, then I say, okay, you have a great day. So that's another thing that's really important, is just being okay, trusting God with what he's going to do with everything that you're doing. So everything with evangelism and witnessing, I just trust that God's going to use it however he's going to use it. Even if I feel like maybe my words weren't perfect or whatnot, God's going to use it how he's going to use it. And I just trust that he's helping people to think about these things through the gospel tracts and through the different conversations I have with people. And so that's something I try and encourage myself with, is this is not about me. This is about Jesus being glorified, about the gospel being shared, about God being glorified, and not about me and how I look or, anything like that. So I think gospel tracts are a great tool in evangelism. And I agree with Charles Spurgeon that when preaching and private talk are not available, to always have gospel tracts ready. You can't always have a full-on conversation with someone. And so in that case, I love giving out gospel tracts. But even when you can't have a conversation, this is a great thing to leave with someone, to take with them, to reflect on, because you probably will never see them ever again, or to start a gospel conversation. They're really wonderful tools. And again, check out Living Waters for all the different options of different gospel tracts. They have one that on the front it says, "Are you good enough to go to heaven?" And that's a great one. That one unfolds to like super wide, and it's got a lot of panels, but it goes more in depth and unpacks each of the 10 commandments to show someone, because most people think that they're good enough to go to heaven. A lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people they tell me straight up, oh yeah, I think I'm good enough to go to heaven. I've never killed anyone. Most people think they're good enough to go to heaven that I've talked to. And so I love that gospel tract because it really breaks down the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments are God's moral law. And God's moral law shows us our sinful state before a holy God. And it shows us that we need a Savior. The law points us to a Savior, and it points us to our need for a Savior. And so I love that gospel tract. I brought a bunch with me, but they're all in Spanish on this trip. And that's something I do love. I love that Living Waters has the gospel tracts in Spanish. I'm not sure if they have them in other languages. I think they might, but it's great having them in Spanish, because when I meet someone and they speak Spanish, if I have a Spanish gospel tract, I won't be able to have a conversation with them, but I'll be able to hand them a gospel tract and just trust that it, if they read it, that, the gospel, that they'll hear the gospel. And that's really awesome too. But yeah, that's a great, the Are You Good Enough to Go to Heaven gospel tract is really great. I usually don't hand them out the way I do with these. These are just smaller and they're easier to start a conversation. Those are more, I use more so after I've had a conversation with someone or given someone this or shared the gospel with someone. I might leave them with that if they want it, or if they, if it was a good conversation, I might leave them with that. Or any conversation. If I have them with me, I like to give them out after I start the conversation. So that's all I have for this video. Please subscribe if you are interested in ways to go about evangelism, if you're interested in how I go about evangelism, things I've learned over the years, and kind of experiences I've had and conversations I've had. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.